the library!
Ricco and Robbio were both Chilean merchants of the Republic of Verzo, famous for laying the foundations of the Silk Road as we know it today. The foundations of the Silk Road may have been laid millennia earlier in history, as there are whisperings that this formation existed across continents earlier and earlier in history than perhaps even before Sigmar's lifetime. However, these accounts seem to have been lost, forgotten, or stolen, as they were not widely known of by 1699. Chilean traders at this time did not know what lay beyond the World's Edge Mountains and the Dark Lands. In that year of 1699 IC, the brothers Ricco and Robbio, Chilean merchants at Karazakarak, bought a tattered but exceptionally fine silk banner from some dwarf adventurers who had been far to the east. They claimed to have captured it from a band of hobgoblins. The banner bore the symbol of a dragon, and the dwarfs, not bothered about keeping what they believed to be an elf banner, were eager to sell it for gold. The significance of the banner was not lost on Ricco and Robbio. If it was an elf banner captured by the hobgoblins, it would be an answer to the question which had been vexing the minds of many Chilean merchants. Was it possible to get to Ulthuan by going eastwards as an overland route, instead of sailing westwards over the sea? If such a thing were possible, it would mean that Ulthuan was at the eastern end of the great old world continent, stretching far further. It would also mean that the world was round and not flat as most people believed. Elf seafarers had never revealed much about Ulthuan, or indeed the shape of the earth. The Norse seemed to think that it was an island. Marco Colombo, in his writings, speculated as to whether it was an island or a peninsula of a great northern continent attached to Lustria. He believed, as many others, that only this could explain where the Dark Elves came from and why they fought against the High Elves. Ricco and Robbio suspected that if they journeyed far enough to the east, they would either arrive in Ulthuan, or maybe even Lustria, or on the far coast of the Old World continent opposite Ulthuan, in a never-before-seen land. Unfortunately, this coast might be held by Dark Elves. The fine workmanship of the silk banner and its dragon motif suggested a High Elf origin, so perhaps it had been lost in battle with the Dark Elves and captured by hobgoblin lackeys in their employ. Ricco and Robbio scoured the dwarf strongholds of the World's Edge Mountains, seeking more artifacts of elven workmanship which had come out of the east. They acquired a small hoard of objects, including scrolls bearing what appeared to be elven writing, weapons and silks, which dwarf traders were pleased to sell for gold. The two brothers returned to their home city of Verzo and tried to raise funds for an expedition to the east. Their intention was to find an overland route to Ulthuan and possibly even Lustria. This would avoid the hazards of the long sea voyage, and show the High Elves that they might rule the seas, but not the land. It would also allow them to avoid Arabian pirates, and it would enable Verzo to get one up on their trading rivals in Rimas, which was enjoying a monopoly on the western sea trade at the time. The Prince of Verzo was very enthusiastic, and all the merchant princes of the city followed his example. Merchants from Lucini, Miragliano, and Paravona also contributed to the enterprise. It was decided that the expedition was so dangerous that only a powerful armed force could be expected to fight its way across the continent. Therefore, a great mercenary army was gathered, led by the best mercenary commanders of the day. Furthermore, there was a large civilian contingent of merchants, artisans, craftsmen, and others, together with their wives and camp followers. The baggage train stretched for over a mile. The intention was to set up a trading post as far east as possible. As the expedition passed through the lands of the border princes, it gathered further contingents, motivated by sense of adventure. When it reached the dwarf kingdom, several dwarf contingents joined the column, notably slayers attracted by the generally held belief that the expedition was doomed. In 1699, the expedition, now numbering over 1,000 Tileans and various other mercenaries, left Karazakarak for the east, winding in a squelching mass of huge numbers of individuals, travelling up the World's Edge Mountains to the Road of Skulls and beyond. It was many years before anyone in Tilea heard of the fate of the expedition, or what they had discovered. Then, in 1714, a merchant caravan of pack yaks arrived at Verezzo, laden down with bundles of silk. With the bales of silk came a message from Ricco and Robbio explaining they were now residing in the westernmost outpost of the Empire of Cathay. It was now clear that there was no eastern route to Ulthuan or Lustria. The world was indeed flat, and much, much larger than anyone could have imagined. The running theory was now that it was surrounded by walls of ice, which precluded travelling beyond a certain point. Instead of elves, the Tileans had encountered an entirely unknown realm. Indeed, it was a populous empire of vast extent and unimaginable wealth. Apparently, Ricco and Robbio had not been permitted to enter the Empire of Cathay, because, as the Cathayans had politely explained, they were hairy and uncouth barbarians. However, the Dragon Emperor Wu had been intrigued by these strangers. He had been delighted with the return of his banner, the banner of his palace guard, and was gratified to receive the submission and the tribute of the entire land of Tilea, which was a ruse pulled by the cunning Ricco and Robbio in order to avoid being summarily beheaded. The Emperor had agreed to hire the entire expedition, having been impressed by a battle in which the mercenaries had held off a Cathayan army which, although small by Cathayan standards, had in fact outnumbered the Tileans by about 3-1. Since that time, a mercantile quarter had flourished in Shangyang, which is the westernmost outpost of the Cathayan fortress towns on the Silk Road. This was the name by which the trade route to Cathay, opened up by Ricco and Robbio, became known. Trading caravans go along this route very rarely, and only a few reach their destination due to the terrible hazards of the journey and the scourge of Hobgoblin Khan and his great horde which, when all his loyal tribes are drawn up for battle, is said to extend from horizon to horizon. The mercenaries in Shangyang have become the guests of the Emperor of Cathay and valued warriors in his service. The Emperor uses these troops to help defend his western frontier against the wrath of Hobgoblin Khan. Of course, by doing this, the Tileans serve their own interests by keeping open the Silk Road and lining their pockets. The Moon Empress is an immortal dragon and the co-ruler of the Empire of Cathay, with her husband, the Celestial Dragon Emperor. Along with her husband, she spends most of her time in the Celestial City above Weijin, contemplating the destiny of the Empire. Like the other dragons of Cathay, she can shapeshift into human form to communicate with her subjects. The Moon Empress is aligned with the Yin side of harmony, more associated with night and subtlety, but is not evil. She has a strange species of crow men who work as agents, going out across Cathay to root out chaos cultists and other insidious forces on her behalf. The Dragon Emperor and the Moon Empress have 9 children. 5 rule over sections of Cathay, while the whereabouts of the other 4 are unknown. The Jade Dragon is the first, an excellent bureaucrat who dwells in central Cathay and handles edicts from the Dragon Emperor. Li Dao, the Fire Dragon, ruler of the southern provinces, is nominal ruler of the mountains of heaven, master of the burning winds, and lord of the phoenix, who guards against Ind and the Nagas of Huresh, who may approach from the south. Yin Yin is the Azure Sea Dragon, ruler of the eastern provinces and the admiral of the Grand Dragon Fleet. There are also 4 missing children, 3 who may have been killed, trapped or corrupted by chaos or other forces, and 1 which is rumored to be trapped or killed in the Great Dragon River. But the last true, definitely living dragons are our focus. Mao Ying, the Black Storm Dragon, ruler of the northern provinces and commander of the Great Bastion, and Zhao Ming, the White Iron Dragon, ruler of the western provinces and lord of Shangyang. Zhao Ming is the preferred child of the Moon Empress. As one of the rulers of Cathay, he is an immortal dragon who can take human form. This makes him an incredibly powerful combatant, an amazing sorcerer, and a natural leader. He rules over western Cathay and the Ivory Road that leads to the Mountains of Morn. A hardened frontier warrior, he maintains the western edge of the empire and keeps the desert clans in order. This area is a less defended, if less chaotic, and chaotic in the sense of the factions of the north area of the world. The western provinces contain beasts and men of all sorts coming from further west, as well as the regular incursions of skaven and ogres from the Warpstone Desert and the Mountains of Morn. The creation of the Great Moor still hangs heavy on this area, even as an uneasy peace maintains. Many trade caravans leave Cathay from Zhao's domain, and particularly to and from the mighty city of Shangyang, seen as a gateway to the west, and should they be successful, he will reap the wealth and prestige, which is usually important to the Iron Dragon, as he is not as beloved by his father as his older sister, although rumors say the Moon Empress has a soft spot for her son, her preferred child. Zhao Ming is a natural-born warrior, although less innately skilled than his sister to the north. He is talented as an alchemist and shows great preference for the art among his armies, leading to presence of sorcerous cabals of metal wizards in Zhao Ming's realm, much to the chagrin of those that find the insidious magics worrying for the Empire, such as the Jade Dragon, who sees the encouragement of sorcerous organizations outside the Celestial Court as dangerous to the Empire's stability. These sorcerers help the Iron Dragon in his experiments of alchemy. Many magical weapons and armor are forged inside the dragon cities. These cabals use the city of Shangyang as a base for their expeditions to the Warpstone Desert. Some never return. Others come back loaded with exotic ores that end up in the forges, with the Iron Dragon as enthusiastic as any of the other alchemists to begin experimenting. Zhao Ming is as skilled as an artisan as those drawn to him, since he has a dragon's lifespan to perfect such expertise and research the mysteries of arcane metallurgy. The strange elements found in the Warpstone Desert have only deepened Zhao's fascination and understanding of alchemy, but also many fear his mind is permanently damaged from the exposure, and many eccentricities or erratic behaviors that he displays are very worrying to his siblings. While the other dragons are cold-blooded and detached from the mortals they rule, the Iron Dragon will share a jape, or even drink, with his followers. Such mortal behavior inspires loyalty within his legions that makes him stand apart from his kin. This makes him far more gregarious as a character than his eldest sister, Mao Ying, and he gets especially offended by her aloofness. In any case, even if his siblings look upon him with suspicion, the Moon Empress is very fond of her son, and will shield him from ire when the family assemblies become less than harmonic. Mao Ying, the Storm Dragon, master of the storm winds, and supreme matriarch of Nangao, is the ruler of the northern provinces of Cathay and castellan of the Great Bastion. As the eldest child of the imperial family, she is an immortal dragon that can take human form. She is arguably the most powerful dragon alive, save her mother and father. Immense power and immense responsibility land on her shoulders, and she can seem cold and aloof in comparison to her siblings. The defense of the realm, the future of Grand Cathay, and much more is quite the burden to bear. Cold and aloof, she has ruled over the northern provinces for centuries, and maintains their defences with strength of arms and wondrous war machines. For the Great Bastion is the shield that protects Cathay from the ruinous powers of the north, and while it stands strong, so too does Cathay prosper. Largely considered the favourite of her father by the other dragons, the Storm Dragon lords her position over her siblings, and when they meet often stands apart from them. Her younger brother Zhao Ming in particular is far more gregarious, and they clash often, personality-wise. Despite her power, the Storm Dragon has a significant task in defense of the north, as that is why she was picked for it, and her armies are almost constantly at war. There's a reason why the Grand Bastion is where it is, of course. Added to this, the independence of the lords of Nangao, whom she relies upon to arm the Great Bastion with their wondrous war machines. Outwardly they work together, but the lords often scheme amongst themselves and against her, dividing her attention from the Empire's enemies beyond the wall. Her vaunted position also means her father entrusts her with important tasks, some of which can put her at odds with her siblings, especially if she is required to deal with chaos incursions within the Empire itself. The Celestial Dragon Emperor is the deifical, if you will allow me a strange turn of phrase, ruler of the Empire of Cathay, the largest and certainly the most populous by an order of magnitude human nation in the world. He rules over this vast landmass of many different peoples and cultures, and his subjects number untold millions. The Dragon Emperor is said to be immortal, but the names of several different emperors are known. Some believe that he is an actual dragon in the form of a man. He leads the Grand Cathay along with his wife, the Moon Empress, and their children, which drive the nation together, as a series of barons would in a lesser one. The known emperors are few and far between in the West. Emperor Zhen Huang ruled around -3000 IC. Under his reign, the neighboring ogre tribes, who had maintained peaceful relationships with Cathay, started to devour human children along the border. His coven of astromancers may have had a hand in the genocidal arrival of the Great Moor Comet that crashed into the ogre homelands and drove them westwards, as well as corrupting their psyche and lifestyle forever. An unnamed dragon emperor unified the land of Cathay into a single empire After this, around minus 2000 IC, he ordered the construction of the Great Bastion, a gigantic fortified wall, to protect his new empire against the marauding tribes of the Hung and Kurgan. This great task, the entire unification of the Greater Cathay region, or Grand Cathay, was undertaken in under a century. And this impenetrable fortress wall, a quarter of a mile high, from Nangao in the west to Weijin in the east, spanning league upon league across the border of Cathay, is known as the Dragon's Spine, as well as the Great Bastion and the Great Wall. It rises like a giant wave breaker against chaos incursions from the north. Less than 3 centuries after its construction, the World's Edge Mountains were riven by earthquakes, sending much of the dwarf empire into jeopardy and decline. Sections of the Great Bastion collapsed as well, allowing rampaging northern tribes and barbarians to spill into Cathay. During the year 1310, other series of earthquakes caused part of the Great Bastion to collapse. A truly colossal invasion ensured that scores of the battle-hungry Kurgan tribes that roamed the eastern steppes flooded into the rich and ancient empire of Cathay. Hordes of chaos warriors battled legions of terracotta automatons, attempting to shore up the Great Wall with their own clay bodies. Mutated war mammoths gorged and trampled whole regiments of one-eyed ogres, and in the skies above, demon princes dueled with bejeweled gold dragons. The Cathayans ultimately blunted the invasion, but not before the Chaos Horde had carved a bloody path into the heartland of the Orient. The Tower of Asher is a Cathayan outpost to the northeast of the Great Bastion that overlooks the Silk Road and the mountain passes coming down from the Mountains of Morn. From this jade-green tower of magical stone, the servants of the Dragon Emperor survey the great road and keep watch for signs and portents of woe, threats from distant lands. It is a true quirk of history that this unnamed Dragon Emperor remains unnamed, despite his foundational significance to the land of Cathay, and Grand Cathay especially. Only the Cathayans know the true secrets of why he was not recorded in such manners, but it's likely that scholars of the West are not accessing a wealth of knowledge which is kept under lock and key, away from the eyes of barbarians. Regardless, Emperor Wu of the Wu dynasty was crowned later in 1676 IC. In 1690, the 14th year of his reign, he sent a large fleet to invade and conquer the Southlands in order to compete with Araby in the spice trade. The invasion ended in utter failure due to 2 great typhoons that dispersed and sunk the fleet. It was probably the same Emperor Wu who met Ricco and Robbio's large Chilean expedition in 1699. In the end, he hired its members to protect the western borders of his empire against the hobgoblin hordes. Emperor Zhang Jimu, whose wives were saved from the executioner cult of the Jade Pearl by the questing knight Leofric Karad, is another westernly known emperor. He later travelled on to Ind, south of Cathay, and quested within the Caves of Fire, interfacing with ancient beings that dwell there. The last known recorded emperor in the West is Emperor Pu Yi, who led Cathayan forces against Hablo Khan at the Battle of Zen Tu, but was defeated when the great horde of Hobgoblin Khan arrived. It is unclear whether Pu Yi died in the battle or managed to escape back to Cathay, with little more than his poo and wee being smeared across the battlefield, rather than his blood and entrails. Very few emperors are known to the West, but perhaps this is something that will change in the very near future.
Yin Tuan was captain of one of the great war junks of the ill-fated invasion fleet that was dispatched by Dragon Emperor Wu of Cathay to conquer and colonize the Southlands. Emperor Wu's invasion was intended to secure the spice trade, motivated by an intense rivalry with Araby. Long before the rest of the fleet sailed to its ultimate doom, however, Yin Tuan's war junk was blown off course by the typhoon that scattered the fleet shortly after it put to sea. His crew sighted land again after almost 10 months at sea. For 2 months they had fed on nothing but poisonous fish, and half the crew were dead, and the rest were ill. Yin Tuan made sail for the land straight away, and his men made camp along the shores of the strange Lustrian coast, and feasted upon its tropical fruits until all were well and strong. During this time, the Cathayans saw none of the inhabitants and had no idea where they were. A party of men ventured inland and returned several days later, having found a huge statue carved in the shape of a lizard man. Yin Tuan ordered everyone to stay near the camp, and then at length he gathered soldiers and sailors, numbering 123 men in all, and discussed what to do. Yin Tuan told the men that he had calculated from his charts and astronomical observations that they were on the other side of the world sphere from Cathay. Many shook their heads in despair. No one was willing to attempt the journey back the way they had come and endure the same perils all over again. Their spirits were raised when he mentioned that because it was known that the Southlands were inhabited by lizard men, known vaguely in Cathay as lizard demons, the statue was proof that they had reached there. If they marched overland, they believed that they would meet up with the fleet, which should by now have landed on the eastern side, and that they would encounter little opposition because the army of the lizard men would have gone eastwards to fight the invaders. After marching for several days, cutting their way through dense jungle and hungrily feeding on wild rice and tree frogs, the expeditioners encountered more lizardmen statues. Soon afterwards they entered a wide clearing and were stunned to see 3 huge stone structures rising up in a stepped formation. These were completely overgrown with vegetation and carved in the likeness of countless heads of lizardmen. They made camp on the platform at the top of the highest edifice for safety. At sunrise on the next day, they were suddenly awoken by a strange sound. The entire jungle seemed to be moving and quivering around them. When the jungle mist cleared, they looked down upon a sea of lizard men filling the entire clearing. They were the colour of jade, with yellow crests, and they were marching in unison. None of them had noticed the Cathayans in their vantage point. Tsu Kuo, a soldier with very keen eyesight, pointed out where they were coming from. A huge, square-shaped lake, like a vast paddy field on the edge of the clearing. They were making rasping noises, droning like Cathayan chanting monks. There were at least 10,000 of them. Fearing for their safety, the expeditioners hid on top of the platform for the whole day until the sun set. The next day, the clearing was empty. The lizard horde had moved through the jungle without flattening the vegetation, but it was possible to see which way they had gone, so Yin Tuan avoided going the same way. His men marched on eastwards for several days. That was until Lin Po, a good and courageous soldier, reported that they were being followed. Nothing happened until they were clear of dense jungle and had begun wading through a shallow mangrove swamp. As soon as they were in the open, several men at the rear of the column were slain by arrows and javelins thrown by unseen enemies lurking among the tangled mangrove roots. Yin Tuan immediately gave the order to make a defensive formation. Suddenly, hundreds of jade-coloured skinks emerged from the undergrowth, armed with vicious weapons. This time, luckily, their arrows fell harmlessly upon their lacquered tiger shields. The Cathayans replied with their crossbows, slaying several of them before they scurried back to the trees. The jungle fell silent once again. Then a flock of birds suddenly scattered out from the trees, and close on their heels, a Kroxigor armed with a huge bronze axe charged towards them. It crashed through the shields and began chopping to the left and right. It took 23 crossbow bolts to fell this mighty lizard warrior, because the thick scales which covered its carcass provided better protection than even the lacquered scale armour worn by the Emperor's bodyguard in Cathay. In the end, they lost many men, because even those who had been slightly wounded by the enemy's arrows had simply died, since these arrows were tipped with a lethal poison. Similar ambushes occurred every time they broke from the cover provided by the trees and had to cross expanses of open marsh. Every day Yin Tuan lost more men. The lizardmen were experts in concealing themselves among the marsh plants and were able to approach dangerously close by keeping most of their bodies underwater. Only their eyes and nostrils were visible, just like crocodiles. Then at close range they would emerge and shoot a hail of well-aimed poisoned arrows. After one skirmish, Yin Tuan noticed a warrior taking something from a fallen comrade and hiding it in his clothing. Seeing the glint of gold, the captain ordered him to show it to him. It was a plaque inscribed with the symbols of the lizardmen. Yin Tuan made him confess at great length that 7 soldiers had taken them from a chamber in one of the buildings in the ruined city. Furious that these men had deceived him and brought misfortune upon his company, Yin Tuan beheaded the remaining 6 himself. Then he had the golden plaques left beside the executed men, and the column marched on. This pacified their assailants, who were only intent on recovering their sacred objects. There were no further ambushes. Yin Tuan was surprised when he reached the sea after only 17 days, having thought it not possible to cross the Southlands in such a short time. Then he realized that it was not the same ocean that divides the Southlands from Cathay. He must have crossed the Isthmus of Pahawks, between Lustria and Nagaroth, unknowingly passing near the Norse colony of Skegi, and even nearer to the temple city of Pahawks. And now he was before the great ocean, of which Cathayan sages knew nothing about. Everyone was in great despair, so he decided to start work on building a new vessel immediately. It took them only 2 weeks to make a very fine and large sampan with a good outrigger and 3 sails of woven reeds. They also made a raft and filled it with fruit and gourds full of fresh water, and then put to sea in one boat and towed the raft behind them. The new ship maintained course towards the east, and they were at sea for several weeks. They had almost eaten all of their fruit, which was now rotten, before they once again sighted land. The prevailing winds and currents carried Yin Tuan far to the south of Ulthuan, and blew him towards the coast of the Southlands, which the party hoped would have been conquered by then. Yin Tuan now had only 73 of a mix of soldiers and sailors remaining in his command. They marched inland once again. The landscape was similar in many ways to Lustria. After hacking their way through the dense jungle, they emerged in a vast area of parched ground, with tall clumps of grass and razor-sharp leaves. In the middle of this expanse, the sharp-eyed Tu Quo spotted a creature flying high above them. It was a pterodon, carrying 2 ochre, red-crested skink riders on its back. The flying creature let out a mournful cry when it saw them, which filled the men with dread and foreboding. Yin Tuan ordered them to shoot at it with their crossbows to bring it down before the riders could fly off and warn the leader of their whereabouts, but unfortunately they did not hit it, and it immediately flew away. The enemy attacked at dusk. They took the Cathayans by surprise, and they could not see to shoot their crossbows. The creatures which attacked them were Saurus warriors that came at them in ranks, armed with spears and shields. They fought savagely, thrusting with their heavy bronze and volcanic glass-tipped spears. The soldiers could not stand against them, and Yin Tuan was struck heavily with a mace from behind and fell unconscious. When he regained his senses, he found himself to be bound hand and foot to a long pole. It was being carried by several of the same Saurus who had overwhelmed his men. Ahead of him he could see the faithful Tzu Quo, also tied to a carrying pole. He shouted out to him, and he replied that everyone else was dead. This shouting provoked a skink chief, who seemed to be in charge of the column. This officer was magnificently bedecked in gold bangles and exotic feathers. He brandished his spear and began talking in an unintelligible tongue, so Yin Tuan decided to remain quiet. They endured a terrible journey for several days. Occasionally water was poured into his mouth from a gourd, and what little food he got consisted of bitter-tasting dried grubs, but amazingly they staved off his hunger, and were actually quite nice. Eventually they passed along a paved road between rows of crouching lizardman statues and entered a broad open plaza. There were ruins here, like in the first lizardman city, great edifices rising up in steps. These, though, were far bigger and in better repair. All around there was noise and activity from the gangs of skinks scurrying about on various tasks. Massive blocks of carved stone were being dragged up a vast ramp on one side of a tall stepped building. Croxigors were bearing the strain of the ropes, while the skinks directed the work. In other places, groups of skink priests were engaged in heated debates, accompanied by rows of seated scribes writing on clay plaques. Tzu Quo and Yin Tuan were taken out of the bright daylight and manacled to the wall of a dank and dark vault, guarded by two Saurus. The next day, they were led out and taken up countless steps until they emerged into the dazzling sunlight. They were goaded out onto a platform which was halfway up the side of one of the huge stepped structures. There were guards and dignitaries of the lizardmen on all sides. On the steps above and below were ranks of skinks, beating huge drums in unison. Far below, the plaza was full of a dense mass of lizardmen of all types, arranged, it seemed, in regiments. The steps of the other great buildings were also covered in rank upon rank of lizardmen. All the lizardmen around them suddenly turned and began making obeisance towards the top of the great edifice. High up on the top platform, a palanquin emerged from the darkness of an ornate doorway. On top sat a slan mage priest, a creature never before seen by Cathayans. The gold and jade ornaments that it was wearing glinted like jewels in the sun. By the great respect being shown by all the lizardmen, Yin Tuan took this being to be the king or the high priest of the city. This great one made a gesture, and all the lizardmen ceased their obeisance and began their rasping incantations. Before the prisoners was a deep pit from which rose a foul stench. Tzu Quo and Yin Tuan were prodded towards its edge as a sacrifice to the Old Ones. Tzu Quo bravely stood to attention, preparing to meet his ancestors like a true soldier of the Emperor. He kept his composure even as he was hurled into the pit. When Yin Tuan was grabbed by the Saurus to meet the same destiny, however, his silk tunic tore and revealed his imperial dragon tattoo on his back, which resembled an archaic image of the god Sotek, giving the skink priests and their slan master a problem to ponder and delaying the sacrifice of Yin Tuan. The ritual was brought to an end, and he was led back down to the vault, whilst they decided what to do. At nightfall, Yin Tuan noticed that the reactions of the Saurus were not quite as good during the coolness of the night. They seemed sluggish and tired almost. Summoning all the energy that he had left, he performed a single somersault, and although he was not the best disciple of martial arts, he succeeded in catching hold of the carvings on the edge of the light shaft of the vault. He moved so fast that the lizardmen were not able to stop him, and could only growl below him, jabbing upwards with their spears. Yin Tuan hauled himself out of the shaft, and found himself out in the open at the top of the light shaft, on the lowest step of the temple. He did not waste any time, and ran as fast as he could towards the jungle, with bronze manacles still attached to his hands and legs. He kept going throughout the night, without stopping to rest until he was exhausted. He could hear the war drums of the lizardmen beating the alarm in the distance and knew that they would be following him. He suddenly came out of the jungle onto the banks of a river. He stumbled along the bank, tugging at logs among the mangrove roots and debris of fallen trees until he managed to move one. He dragged it into the water and lay on top of it. Soon he was drifting with the current. As he slowly glided off to sleep, he thought that it was very good fortune that the river was flowing eastwards. Suddenly he awoke. His feet were in the water and in excruciating pain, bitten by carnivorous fish. Somehow he managed to stay on top of the log, keeping himself awake until the sun had risen. All day he drifted with the current under the burning sun. He had escaped the lizardmen at last, but it seemed certain that he would die anyway and be eaten by the fish. At length, the log was washed up on a vast sea bank. He dragged himself ashore and slept. The next day, he began to walk across the sandbank until he had reached the far side. The water was a different colour, the colour of the ocean. It tasted salty, but he didn't care as he rejoiced at finally reaching the Sea of Terror at last. He could tell from the sun's position that he was on the northern bank of the river mouth, and so began to walk northwards, reasoning that sooner or later he would reach the fleet of the Emperor anchored off the coast and be rescued. Yin Tuan walked slowly for days, eating shellfish and birds' eggs. He managed to break free of the manacles on his wrists and ankles by bashing them with rocks. As time wore on, he began to see ships' timbers scattered on the sand which had drifted in on the tides. As he proceeded further northwards, he saw the scattered hulks of ships. Soon he recognized them as imperial war junks of Cathay. At first, he thought that these were the other junks which had been scattered and shipwrecked in the typhoon. He found no survivors, only a few bleached bones which had been picked clean by the birds. Yin Tuan sat down in despair. Before him was a terrible sight. The whole beach was full of wrecked junks and strewn with countless bones. It was all that remained of the mighty invincible fleet of Imperial Cathay. Over 1,000 war junks and 100,000 men. He wandered along the wrecks for hours and found no sign of any survivors. The misfortune that befell the fleet had occurred too long ago. He camped on the beach for several days before he saw the sails of a junk out at sea. He lit a fire of old tarred driftwood to signal it. Soon the junk approached close to the shore. It was a trading junk on the spice route to Araby, flying the banner of the Taipings, who were well-known spice traders. They sent out a sampan for him as he waved and shouted from the beach. The crew were surprised to see him and very anxious to be gone from that place as quickly as possible. From them he learned that the Emperor's fleet had been wrecked while at anchor by a second terrible typhoon. The survivors had marched inland and disappeared. The Emperor had therefore ordered all traders to keep watch on the coast for any sign of banners. Yin Tuan was the only survivor of that mighty expedition to be found alive. He returned to Cathay and was received into the presence of the Emperor himself to give his account. The Emperor ordered that it should be recorded for posterity and rewarded him with the command of the palace guard.
Stick 'em with arrows, stick 'em with knives and swords and spears, stick 'em quick and stick 'em where it hurts. But most of all, stick 'em when they's looking the other way.
Lorehammer Library! Occasionally the spiteful infighting and backstabbing that is rife within the ranks of hobgoblins throws up particularly successful and feared killers who rise to prominence and style themselves as Khans. These skulking killers can prove useful for marshalling their kin in battle, but if they are serving the Chaos Dwarves, should they prove too successful and seen as even the remotest threat to the dominance of their masters, they will most likely end up impaled over their lord's gatepost as a reminder to others of the rewards of getting ideas above their station. On the eastern steppes, however, this could be done to a lesser Khan by the overlord Hobgoblin Khan. Far out on the eastern steppes, Hobgoblin Khan is the greatest Khan of the Hobgoblin Empire. His warriors are a major, ever-present threat for caravans, 90% of which never complete the Silk Road trade route safely. It is said that when all the tribes loyal to Hobgoblin Khan are drawn up for battle, his horde extends from horizon to horizon. The Dragon Emperor of Grand Cathay maintains several fortresses on his western frontier, such as Shangyang, where the Tilean traders keep an additional mercenary garrison, to defend his realm, primarily from the wrath of Hobgoblin Khan. All fame is fleeting, and all glory ultimately fades away. The renown of the Hobgoblin chieftains tends to fade away more quickly than most, usually with the help of a dagger, poison, or nasty accident. Gordur's backstabber has outlived most of the other tribal leaders, thanks to a naturally distrustful disposition and lashings of low cunning. He has also been lucky as the hardened scar tissue that crisscrosses his massive bony shoulder hump testifies. Fated, lucky, sneaky, call it what you will, Gordur's backstabber has an enduring talent for survival. A Hobgoblin chieftain in service as a mercenary commander to the Chaos Dwarfs. He reaps a heavy toll on the enemies of Hashut in order to gain access to a share of their spoils and slaves. Ogre Khan is famous for his merry band known as Ogre Khan's Wolf Boys, which are an infamous band of hobgoblin mercenaries hailing from the eastern steppes. They are hired as mercenaries by anyone except for dwarfs, high elves, wood elves, the Empire, and Bretonia.
You paid? We slays!
Far, far in the east, in the untamed steppes beyond the Darklands, independent from the Chaos Dwarf Empire, lies the dominion of Hobgoblin Khan, the most infamous empire in the world, and perhaps the greatest. The subjects of Hobgoblin Khan are a green-skinned race related to orcs and goblins, and widely abhorred for their cruelty, wickedness, and appalling standards of hygiene. The armies of the Great Hobgoblin Khan are simply referred to as the Great Horde. When all tribes under the Great Khan are arrayed for battle, the Horde stretches from horizon to horizon, and sub-commanders of these tribes are also called Khans, each one commanding 500 or more wolf-riding hobgoblins in a huge cavalry army. Ogre Khan was one of the prime vassals of the Great Khan and enjoyed the favor of the green-skinned despot. His tent was as large as the hall of any human noble, and he owned 100 wolves, making him a very wealthy hobgoblin. In times of war, he would summon 600 spears to battle. Ogre fought in many battles for the Great Khan, and became widely known for his prowess in combat and his treachery, traits admired by all hobgoblins. It seemed that he was destined to become one of the most influential warlords of the era. Ogre Khan's fortunes changed during the battle, which has gone down in infamy, of Zen-Tu, where the hobgoblins clashed with the Cathayans of Emperor Pu Yi. When Hablo Khan, the commander of the Hobgoblin contingent, was killed by the Emperor's champion Tong Po, many of the other Hobgoblins fled, believing that it was all lost. Ogla, on the other hand, immediately switched sides and led his lads into battle against his kinsman. All was going well until the main horde of Hobgoblin Khan arrived. They outnumbered the Cathians more than 100 to 1 and crushed them swiftly. Ogla Khan turned tail and fled from the wrath of his ruler. Ogla Khan and his tribe were declared outlaws and banished from the Hobgoblin lands. With no other place to go, Ogla Khan and his lads headed west to the Old World. Following the Silk Road, he arrived in the Dark Lands and immediately enlisted in the army of Black Orc warlord Dordug Smasher. Dordug was determined to raid the lands of Tilea, but in the Battle of Long Knives he suffered a catastrophic defeat as Ogla Khan switched sides during a crucial moment of the battle. The Tilean general Giovanni Giuliani rewarded Ogla Khan generously and hired the Hobgoblins to act as scouts and skirmishers in his army. Since those times, Ogla Khan has served as a mercenary under many generals and acquired quite a name for himself. Though only few of his original 600 warriors have survived, they are now battle-hardened veterans and much in demand. Hobgoblins are excellent archers and ferocious in hand-to-hand combat, so there is only one thing a general must consider when hiring them. Will they stay loyal? The Wolf Boys fight in a unit of 6 to 20 Hobgoblin Wolf Raiders, including Ogla Khan, a standard-bearer and hornblower. All of them are unwashed, shifty and wicked warriors, wearing furs, exotic scale armor and spiked helmets. They carry black wolf-tail standards to battle, proclaiming that they do not come in peace. In battle they ride giant wolves and fight with scimitars, spears, bows and shields. Ogla Khan wears dented light scale armor and carries a wickedly barbed spear as well as a curved scimitar, a bow and shield. On his shoulders he wears the pelt of Wolfag. Wolfag was a legendary giant wolf, the steed of Kenge Khan, the founder of the Hobgoblin Empire. The pelt was a gift from the great Khan when Ogla still enjoyed favor of the Lord of the Steppes. It carries an ancient blessing of the Hobgoblin shamans, so that no enemy who turns his back on the Hobgoblins can escape alive. Gazak Khan, Terror of the East, is the greatest Hobgoblin Khan ever to venture out of the eastern steppes. Very few of these savage greenskins have ever been seen in the lands of the Old World, but one of them is known well in the lands of Tilea and the kingdoms of the south. Besides Ogla, Gazrak Khan, the butcher of the Toriko fields, the terror of the East, and the commander of the Black Wolf mercenaries. Gazak is one of the most successful mercenary generals of the age. His army includes many of the most infamous mercenary regiments, like Manglar's mutant goblins, the Long Knife orc warriors, and the dreaded war trolls of the Grey Mountains. With these and many other ruthless cutthroats, Gazak's band has developed a fearsome reputation as utterly merciless warriors who will not shy from slaughtering and eating entire populations of cities and burning scores of villages to the ground in their campaigns. When the black wolf-tail standards of Gazak are seen on the horizon, men grow desperate, for the mighty hobgoblin has never been defeated in the open field. Of his past in the steppes beyond, Gazak speaks little. Indeed, it is very difficult to understand the grunting language of the hobgoblins, and those who have ever dared to ask anything have usually been beheaded by Gazak. However, it is said that he is one of the most powerful of the war chiefs who the great Hobgoblin Khan sent to study the lands beyond. This claim is supported by traders who have travelled into the steppes of the east and visited the ruler of the Hobgoblin nation in his tent, said to be the size of a small village, who say that the green-skinned despot is ever hungry for new conquests. Perhaps Gazak is but the first of the great horde to cross the mountains, and one day the countless wolf riders of Hobgoblin Khan will cross the world's edge mountains and sweep the nations of men before them. In battle, Gazak rides Warhammer, a gigantic wolf the likes of which has never been seen in the lands of the West. In his hand he carries a huge scimitar which promises red ruin for his opponents. Gazak wears a monstrous helmet over his scarred head. His ululating war cry is famous, very loud and justly feared. Gazak Khan rides the giant wolf Vargan, wears dented heavy-scale armor, and the demon head helmet, a huge horned helmet decorated with a black wolf tail, which holds a captured wind demon of the steppes that protects Gazak if he is wounded, and carries the magical red scimitar, a red curved sword notched in hundreds of savage battles by the Khans of the Black Wolf clan, which has acquired a dire reputation in Gazak's hands. The evil count had us surrounded on all sides. We were cut off from the rest of the army, left with no choice but to fight to the last man against his undead horrors. Yet as we steeled ourselves for this final battle, something strange happened. The hobgoblin scouts the Count had hired started fighting his own troops. Seeing a chance for escape, I led the charge.
There's nothing in life as proper as hunting from the back of a hard-taught wolf. Their speed and grace makes the world flow by as a stream. Prey who manage to give a good fight and die with some dignity are way better than those what scream and soil their breeches. But I take whatever I catch, all the same.
The hobgoblins are a distinctive subspecies of steppe-dwelling goblin that are found only within the lands to the far east, in the rolling, untamed plains of the eastern steppes, where lies the domains of Hobgoblin Khan and his Hobgoblin Empire, the greatest greenskin empire in the known world.
Lorehammer Library!
The Hobgoblin race are considered traitors by all their greenskin cousins, not because of their unbelievably treacherous nature, but by their treacherous betrayal of the greenskin uprising of Zarnagrund specifically. This ultimate betrayal of their entire race, and their inability to trust even each other, has ensured that the hobgoblins have become utterly enthralled to the brutal protection and patronage of the Chaos Dwarves, making them in many ways the perfect slaves. Though hated by their kin, the hobgoblins are nonetheless the scourge of the steppes, feared, hated, and powerful in almost equal measure. Hobgoblins are widely abhorred for their cruelty, wickedness, and their appalling standards of hygiene. Few imperial scholars would be perverse enough to note the important differences between an ordinary goblin and a hobgoblin, and the truth is that the two subspecies are really quite similar. Physically, the hobgoblins are slightly taller, almost as tall as a man, yet they still walk in a stoop posture with a smaller nose, needle-like teeth, and a perpetual sneer. Their red eyes are sly and shifty, and almost all hobgoblins have a distinct bony hump on their back, further emphasizing their slovenly slouch. This bony plate that protects a hobgoblin's back is most likely evolved due to one single defining characteristic that is more extreme than in any of the other greenskin race. To all those who have ever faced a hobgoblin in person, they are known for being famously irredeemable, remorselessly, and unbelievably conniving and treacherous in their behaviors beyond those of any creature living in the world today, even within the rest of the greenskin realm. Hobgoblins are completely untrustworthy, so much so that they would backstab a friend or ally just to further their own gains without even a second thought, and would more often than not switch sides to those that can pay well or just happen to be on the winning side. Indeed, hobgoblins have a deep suspicion of any creature that doesn't betray its own comrades as soon as it is slightly more advantageous to do so. Self-preservation is a very strong instinct in the hobgoblin's mind, and they will endure any indignity to prolong or improve their miserable lives, or avoid suffering, and anything like hard work. Like other goblin species, the hobgoblins are crafty, sneaky, treacherous, and near downright the most evilest race in the world. In fact, compared to goblins, the hobgoblins seem to bring this way of life to the extreme in their own society. Within their tribes and clans, they seem to form a rather twisted civilization where backstabbing, assassination, and the use of poison is considered perfectly legitimate, and often celebrated or distinguished as a way of advancing in their society. Honor, traditional morals, and the spirit of cooperation is entirely foreign to the hobgoblin's mind. When hobgoblins are not fighting amongst themselves, they make war on other races, mostly towards the great empire of Cathay, whom they have spent much of their history fighting against. However, these hobgoblin clans would also come across nomadic tribes of Northmen, such as the Kurgan and Hung of the Eastern Steppes. Like the hobgoblins, these human warriors are primarily nomadic horse warriors, and huge running battles between thousands of mounted troops regularly sweep across the steppes, staining the plains red with hundreds of battles that have raged on for countless generations. In an effort to stem the tides of the hobgoblins, the emperors of Cathay built the Great Bastion, a 1,000-mile-long wall, hundreds of feet high, which protects Cathay's northern borders from the worst hobgoblin or chaos incursions. Yet the bastion itself is just simply too large for the Grand Empire to completely garrison, so the occasional ravening bands of hobgoblin raiders could break or scale the walls of the bastion and cause havoc to the rice fields and villages that lie beyond. The hobgoblins for all time will always be the ever-present threat towards races living in or near the lands of the Eastern Steppes, including themselves, and will forever be known as the Scourge of the East.
Aye, some of us speak better than our uncouth brethren. Indeed, we do most things better than the others, except perhaps die in droves. We leave that to the goblins and the orcs. My lads ain't particularly interested in falling on fields far from our beloved steppes, although we may be willing to fight if the price is right. What are you offering? It will cost you extra if we have to leave anyone alive.